Okay, Fangman. Okay, welcome everyone to another Astina talk, this time by Alexander Rauscher, who's my colleague here at UBC in Vancouver, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be introducing him today. Alex is a graduate of the TU Technical University in Vienna in engineering physics, but he also spent some, like he says, he wasted some time in a productive manner in Granada in Spain while he was an undergraduate student. He did most of his PhD work and 1.5 years of postdoctoral studies, however, in Jena at the Friedrich Schiller University. So he is biculturally experienced in Austrian and German matters when it comes to academia. But he has been at UBC since 2007, and he's actually a Canada Research Chair, which is quite a prestigious position. He is the CRC in quantitative MRI, a position that he first held under a slightly different name in since 2015, and then it was renewed just this year. So he's been properly vetted and re-established, and it's really very nice to hear that. And he's in the Department of Pediatrics and has associate memberships in the departments of physics and astronomy and radiology. So his current research interests are the development of quantitative MRI methods, so finding out new ways to do new things with the MRI machine, such as quantitative susceptibility mapping and myelin water imaging, which is one of his big research areas, but also the investigation of tissue and isotropy effects on the MRI signal. So he's very much looking at those fine-grained techniques. But he also uses machine learning techniques for image reconstruction. And he's published more than 110 papers, which is pretty impressive, several book chapters on MRI methods and the application to the imaging of concussion, also in hockey players. Multiple sclerosis and the newborn brain. So this is his research expertise, but he's not just working in that field. Alex has been an avid follower of the energy revolution, and so he's been working as a freelance writer and published articles related to energy and nuclear reactors and power generation in Austrian newspapers, such as Salzburger Nachrichten and Der Standard. So Alex knows what he's talking about here as well. And today his talk is entitled, "Does Nuclear Energy Have a Future?" And it's a very Austrian topic in many ways too. So just the right kind of material for Astina. Now I'd like to hand it over to you, Alex, please.
Thank you, Stefan. I'm going to share the screen. You let me know if you're seeing what you should see.
All
yes.
Good.
Okay. Yeah. So thanks for the introduction. So yeah, as you heard, my main field of research is actually not nuclear energy or energy in general, but I have an interest in that topic. And so I'm going to give a bit of my overview of what I have learned in the past 10 or so years about reading about it, and also providing a few occasional freelance articles on the topic. And yeah, so of course, why nuclear energy has come up recently again is because of all kinds of effects that we are seeing now from climate change. This is a picture from the infamous heat dome this summer in northwestern parts of North America, where we reached like at the 50th degree north, 49.6 degrees Celsius in a town called Lytton in British Columbia, just 100 kilometers north from Vancouver, 150 or so. So which is of course unheard of for such latitudes. And this, I believe, is the highest temperature ever recorded in North America outside the Death Valley. So that was on a Monday or Tuesday in June, late June. And on Wednesday, Lytton looked like this because a forest fire destroyed almost the entire town of Lytton because it was so dried out and it was so hot. So it took only a few hours apparently. So this is one of the many effects that we're seeing from climate change. Others are coral bleaching, extreme weather events. This is in Austria this summer, where rainfalls just within minutes cause major flooding because the thunderstorms don't move around as much anymore for some reasons. Hurricanes are more frequent. They're also more destructive because there's more energy in the atmosphere. And what this means, and we all know that, is that we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions drastically. We should cut them in half within the next 9 years. This is basically no time before we know it, it's 2030. And then we have to get to net zero in 2050. Net because there's a few sectors that will probably always produce CO2. So we only get to net zero by also employing some carbon capture technologies by then. Right? So this is basically the path. And that's already a compromise. So 1.5 to 2 degrees is not exactly what the climate scientists would have advocated for, but in these agreements, there's other interests also play a role. So it is actually higher than what would one wish for, but that's kind of manageable. Everything else is not manageable. Plus 3 degrees, plus 3.5 or 4 is absolutely not possible, right? So we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions radically and extremely, right? And those are the radical steps that are necessary so that we have moderate outcomes in 20 or 30 years. Yeah, if we do moderate measures, then we will have radical outcomes in terms of climate catastrophe. So of course, one of the forms of clean energy or CO2-free energy essentially is nuclear energy. This is from the Financial Times on the left on Friday, where they report that England or the United Kingdom is going to heavily invest in nuclear energy to get to net zero. Of course, the International Atomic Energy Association also put out just this weekend or so, or last week, 200 or so page brochure advocating for nuclear energy to get to net zero. There's another reason, and that might come to a little bit of a surprise to some of us, is that nuclear energy is actually quite safe and quite clean. When you compare the numbers of people dying per terawatt hour of energy produced, brown coal is way ahead. That's mostly because of pollution, right? This is not so much due to accidents. Of course, there's mining accidents as well, but it's the air pollution that causes large numbers of deaths compared to the renewable energies and also nuclear energy. Of course, nuclear catastrophes are traumatizing, right? And the fear of something like that happening is also something that should be considered. I don't think that the stress is factored into that here. But nevertheless, air pollution due to fossil fuels far exceeds any other deaths due to nuclear energy. When you look at, you probably all know the resource, Our World in Data, due to COVID, right? They have always good updates. So you find all kinds of information there, including how many people die from various causes. High blood pressure, of course, is leading, right, with cardiovascular disease. That's connected to smoking as well, high blood sugar. And then we already have outdoor and indoor air pollution. Indoor is relevant because a lot of people in poorer countries, they have wood-burning stoves for cooking, and the air is horrible inside these buildings. But outdoor air pollution, if you take out the indoor, plays still a major role, right? So it's definitely not a good thing, and that's from traffic and from generation of energy, essentially. So the question now is, does nuclear energy really have a future? Or put it in other words, is it able to save us from climate disaster? And this is what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. And to get an understanding if this is a viable option, we should look into the history a little bit. So the first nuclear energy electricity generation started in 1956 in the United Kingdom in Sellafield. And currently we have 415 reactors running. I think the peak was about 450 or 460 or so, but they're being shut down because they're old, and they're half a century old. And the typical capacity is 1 gigawatt of a reactor. And that kind of leads to 400 gigawatt currently of nuclear capacity, which produce about 10% of the world's electricity demand, which comes to 2,600 terawatt hours. In comparison, there are currently 54 reactors under construction, most of them in China, who are building 17. And then India, of course, is also investing because it's a rapidly growing country. And then all the others are just minor in terms of their numbers. So basically about a tenth of what we have running right now is also, the tenth of that number is being constructed. This is from Google Earth. This is the Hinkley Point C construction site. So Hinkley Point C was commissioned in 2010, and construction, depending how you count, started in 2013 or 2016. When you go on Google Earth, you start to see the first measures towards construction, like the removal of trees and such things in 2013. So there's already something going on, but they say they started in 2016, probably to make it sound better that it didn't take as long as it actually going to take. Because of course it's already delayed. It was planned to be finished in 2018, but currently they're saying 2026 maybe. When it's finished, it will produce energy for 6 million households, which is quite a bit. Original cost in 2016 was 21 billion. I think when it was commissioned in 2010, it was quite a bit less, but I couldn't find those numbers. And now it's already expected to cost 27 billion. And the decommissioning alone in 2080 will cost 10 billion euro. The construction site is enormous. This is the world's largest mobile crane. It's called Big Carl. It's from a Belgian company that transported that thing in 250 trucks to Hinkley Point. Enormous amounts of concrete are also used and poured into this, and there's major steel constructions. So there's quite a bit of CO2 being produced already due to the concrete, for example. So this is Hinkley Point. So it's delayed. It's enormously expensive, 27 billion euro. And we'll see how many more delays we will get. So you can kind of see that the construction of reactors or nuclear power plants takes on average 9.9 years. But we have some in Austria, for example. There's Mochovce, which started in 1987. Then they stopped construction in 1993, and then they resumed in 2009. So that's how you get to several decades of construction of nuclear power reactors, which isn't great because now we end up with technology that is relatively old in most cases. So this is not a fast technology at all. It takes forever. So the slides that I'm showing here are some of the things is from the World Nuclear Industry status report, which just came out. Very good resource, 400 pages. I didn't read them all, of course, but I took some of the images. It's very good information that they provide. So the big days of nuclear energy were in the 80s, where a lot of reactors were under construction. Interestingly, many were actually abandoned, I think about 10%. Austrians know well about the Zwentendorf, which was finished, but never went online. And to my surprise, and maybe everyone's surprise, there's quite a few reactors that never finished or went online. And right now, as I said, there's about 50 or so being constructed at construction times of around 10 years. Obviously, due to the shutdown, this has led to a decline in nuclear energy from 17.5% in 96 to about 10% now. So that's an important number to keep in mind. 415 or so reactors providing 10% of the world's electricity. China is a bit different. They're ramping it up, but it's, when you look at it at the big scheme, big picture, it's a bit more than a drop in the bucket, I would say. It's making a difference, but it's not a huge difference. We're still sitting at about 10%. Downtime of reactors is also interesting. They're always presented as something that is running all the time, right? That they provide the base load. In a way they do. This is France, which generates about 70 to 80% of the electricity from nuclear energy. And they had on average outage times of 115 days in 2020, which is about a third of the time. So that's the load factor, so to say, is not 100% or 90%, as we often hear. It can be quite a bit less. So here it's about 2/3, so 66% or so. And that leads us to other forms of carbon-free energy or low carbon energy, which is solar energy, and I will also talk about wind energy. Here I'm looking at mostly referring to the photovoltaics report by the Fraunhofer Institute in Freiburg. They release this report every 6 months, and it's a very nice, actually PowerPoint presentation that gives a very good explanation of what's going on in that solar industry. The most important information here is that the cost of photovoltaics has dropped by 90% in the past 30 years. And by 99%, that's not on this plot, by 99% in the past 40 years. And so solar was something for satellites, space probes, space stations, right, because of the enormous cost, but now it has come down. So that, thinking of the late 70s or so, 80s, but now 40 years later, we are down at a fraction of those costs, a tiny fraction of those costs. This declining cost can also be plotted over the amount of, or the capacity that has been installed, or the cumulative capacity. Then you get this, when you fit a curve, that gives you kind of a slope, which is called the learning rate, is kind of the decline in cost per unit installed, essentially, right? And it's essentially the same information. So when you look at 2010, when Hinkley Point was announced, it was €2 per watt peak. Peak means that's the theoretical output of a solar panel, which is never reached, right? That's the under ideal conditions. Of course, there's we have night times, we have rainy days, so you can easily divide that by 3, even for sunnier parts of the world, and by 5 for more northern regions, for example. So you get about 20% of peak, or 20 to 30% of the installed capacity. Anyway, so the cost of the installed capacity was per watt was €2 in 2010, and now it's down to 20 cents. So it has fallen by 90% since then. So Hinkley Point was announced under the impression of a solar cost of €2 per watt peak, but it isn't even finished yet, and is already much more expensive than solar energy. And solar energy is also growing exponentially. And so the production per year is 140 or 150 gigawatt peak again, right? Let's divide that again by 4 or so, or 5. So somewhere in the 30 to 40 gigawatt peak range, which corresponds to 40 average nuclear power reactors, right? But that's every year. So it's growing. So you can see that nuclear energy is growing. It's not growing, it's stagnant, it's declining, and solar energy is growing rapidly. The cumulative installation, so adding it all up, right, is now at more than 700 gigawatt peak. So we have almost reached, well, not quite reached, but soon we will have reached the 400 gigawatt of installed nuclear capacity when we include the load factors of both technologies. Let's say nuclear is at 300 gigawatt when you average over a year, and solar currently is sitting at about, let's say 250 or so, right? So, but with the rapid growth, we will reach a nuclear capacity pretty soon. Relevant for knowing whether one should install solar panels is the kind of the energy payback time, which is surprisingly low. So that's the time it takes a solar power plant to produce the energy that it costs to build and install it. So in Southern Europe and North Africa, it's around a year. So after a year, it basically generates electricity for free. And even in Northern Europe or Central Europe, it's far less than 2 years, which is why it makes sense to actually build solar panel or solar plants in even Central and Northern Europe. And also because of the extremely low cost, of course. So how long does it take to build these things? This is a 90 megawatt solar power plant that's near Berlin in Briest. So they put it on an old airport, as you can still see. It has 90 megawatt, which is not a lot, but it was built in 12 weeks. So that's very fast, right? And it's about 1.6 square kilometers large, and it's at 52 degrees north. So this is far from the equator, but it's still a viable way of generating electricity. And when we look at much larger, that was built in 2012, so quite a while ago already. It can get much bigger. This is a solar park in India, the Butler solar park. It's 40 square kilometers large, has 2.2 gigawatt peak. So this is already in the range of a nuclear reactor. Its cost was 1.3 billion euro, which is far less than a nuclear power plant. And yeah, it's obviously in somewhere in the desert, and it generates probably more like 35% of its peak installation, right? So that's in the sunnier areas of the world. Compare that with Hinkley Point, which costs 8 billion euro per gigawatt. And we're here at about 1.3 billion or so by per, no, less than that for per gigawatt. So it's a fraction. China is also very heavily investing, also for economic reasons, right? They're pushing their solar industry, or have been pushing their solar industry. I'm not sure if I pronounced it correctly, Loyangsha Dam Solar Park in 2013. 4 years later, it's at 850 megawatt peak, which would correspond to a smaller nuclear reactor. They haven't even, they're now building huge cables to go from northwestern China to the southeastern regions where where the large populations are concentrated. So building huge cables to get the electricity down there. So these are enormous projects, but they're happening. What's also happening, which I found very interesting, is, and that I think that's an important message here, solar is something that can be installed with low tech by local communities. So this was done on purpose with oak wood in France, locally in the forests, whatever they find, essentially, right? And they came up with the system. It's very small, it's only 250 kilowatt, which is good enough for, I don't know, a few dozen households, I guess. But the nice thing is you're not using any steel, you're using wood. Wood is binds carbon, steel generates carbon due to its production in the furnaces. So this is basically a very low carbon implementation of solar, right? So wooden structures are definitely an option. This is a very extreme example, right? That where they just use the simplest wood, which is actually nice because that normally these things would be too small to make like wood for construction or timber for construction. But with that kind of approach, it can be used quite easily. Of course, that's not something for a large scale 100 megawatt installation, because you kind of need some more efficient way of using wood. But yeah, you don't have to use steel, which I think is an important message here as well. The other way of generating electricity in a clean way is wind, of course. There has been a lot going on in the past decades. Wind turbines are arranged now from like 1 to 12 megawatt. The General Electric is building a 14 megawatt prototype. I think this thing is in Rotterdam. Large wind farms are now in the 1 gigawatt range as well. Their load factor is much higher. The load factor actually goes up with how tall the tower is. So the higher you go, the more steady the wind is. So they're in the range of like 100 meters or so. So the 60% is for the very tall systems. And the total power installed is already 300 gigawatt. With the load factor of 50 to 60%, I think the average more like 50. That's 300 gigawatt of energy being produced. And that's the same as nuclear energy, essentially, if you take the downtimes of nuclear reactors into account. Modvion is a company that builds wooden towers, again, to avoid the steel, right, and the CO2 with steel production. And they found that the wood is as durable as steel. The question of fire came up, and they say it's actually also very fire resistant, because steel gets soft, it bends, and the whole thing falls down. Whereas if there was a fire, it would actually just affect the sector of the tower, right? And before the fire, people show up and put out the fire. So it's actually as durable or fire resistant as a steel tower. Most large systems are, of course, offshore, but there's also bigger onshore systems. There's one being built in Sweden, which will reach about 4 gigawatt of capacity and cost 6 billion euro, right? And with a load factor of 50%, right? So you're ending up with about 3 billion per gigawatt. Again, way less than the 8 or 9 billion per gigawatt that the kind of extreme example of Hinkley Point will cost the United Kingdom. Here's a plot from the US Department of Energy. The amount of wind electricity that people or that countries produce. Like Denmark is way ahead. They also have a leading company. I think they're called Vestas. They're making good money by exporting their technology. They invested early, which is not surprising. They have the ideal conditions there: wind, offshore, onshore wind in the North Sea. But I mean, some countries have like produced considerable portions of their energy electrically. Right? I found this map here. It's basically the Midwest of North America. Saskatchewan is now investing in wind farms. They're building something relatively big in like southwestern South Saskatchewan. It's very flat there. There's steady winds. Those wind turbines start to work well at like 5 meters per second, right? Which you 5-6 meters per second. You can reach in many parts of the world, right? And of course, in southwestern United States, you would use solar energy anyway, so that there's plenty of energy actually being available. The problem, of course, is storage, right? That's the next big thing. I think the generation of electricity in a carbon-free way is essentially solved, right? Wind turbines and solar panels are basically the solution. So nuclear is in principle a solution. I will tell you later why I don't think it is a solution, but in principle, technically it is. Storage is a big problem because solar and wind are intermittent, so they're not running all the time. Right? The sun doesn't shine all the time. Obviously, wind doesn't blow all the time, so we have to store the energy. This is in the Alps in Salzburg, Carbon, where you can just pump the water up and then store it as potential energy and then let it go down to a turbine when you need it. Battery storage, this is in Australia. This was built by Tesla. Very Elon Musk style. He said, I can deliver it within a certain day. I have to look in my notes. I don't remember, but it was a very short period of time. He said, from the time we signed the contract, you have it in 3 months or so, I think it was, right? And of course, he knew that they would get the contract. They had already built their modules in the factory, right? They just had to deliver and install. So they would get it in 3 months easily. So that's in Australia. Has about 185 megawatt hours. So batteries are expensive. What they can do is they can provide electricity quickly. They kick in very fast, so they can bridge, the few hours of electricity demand, which will then other systems to allow to kick in. This is a liquid air system where they basically you decompress the air and then send it through a turbine and get the electricity back. Electric cars, I think, do play a role because they're like small batteries, right? That will become like omnipresent over the next 10 years or so. And so they're definitely a way of storing electric energy, and maybe people are thinking about how to get them back, the electricity back from those cars, right? That thing on the bottom right is also interesting. This is basically thermal energy stored in crushed rock. It just has a quite high heat capacity. And it's basically a huge heat pump where you expand, like send the hot pump air through the crushed rock. It's at about 600 degrees Celsius, and then send it through a turbine to get the electricity back. Of course, they all have the problem that you don't get all back what you send in, right? So you get about 60 or so % back. Battery is much better, it's 90%, but it doesn't last long. These systems, they can give us energy for a week or so, up to a week, several days. This is thermal storage. This is in Denmark, where they basically have an artificial lake. It's insulated. There will be a roof on that thing. And solar collectors heat the water, and then they use that heat and they send it through a heat pump. They use a heat pump to heat the surrounding town. Another interesting concept is the generation of wind and solar power in Morocco, and they're building a cable now that goes to the United Kingdom over 3,800 kilometers. It's a huge project. It has the advantage they're basically using, of course, the abundance of solar energy, but then when the sun goes down, they get these thermal winds that last all the way until midnight. And so this happens every day, essentially. It's every day sunny. When the sun sets, they get that wind. So they have and then they combine it with a relatively large battery there. So they can basically have a 24-hour reliability based on solar and wind, because the wind kicks in the evening and carries them through almost half of the night, right? And the rest is done by a battery, and then sun rises at 6 a.m. essentially and provides energy until sunset, and then the wind comes again. So that's a very interesting project. It's actually happening. I would have thought 3,800 kilometer undersea cable with a very high capacity is quite demanding, right? But they're doing that actually. So I think there's a lot to do. It's becoming a big topic now because as solar and wind reach, beyond 50 to 60% or so of the energy demand, storage is becoming a big topic, right? And Denmark, for some days, generates more wind electricity than that they can use, right? And they can't really store it yet. Well, that brings us back to nuclear energy. So the situation is we have 450 reactors in 60 years, right? 50 under construction. They cost about 20 billion per power plant. They produced 10% of the world's electricity demand. And that's where it gets complicated, right? So we have to, if we assumed that nuclear energy should provide 50% of our electricity by 2050, right? We also would have to assume that the electricity demand will double. This is something that we want, right? We want electric cars. We want the heating to be electric with heat pumps. We want everything electric, essentially, and go away from fossil fuels. So that and of course, poorer countries, we want to catch up as well. And there's a bit of a misconception. You hear often, as a side note, that if they currently have they have energy poverty, right? If we brought them to enough energy right now at this today, right, using fossil fuels, it would only increase the CO2 emissions of the entire planet by a few percent, right? So by removing their energy poverty, right? And of course, we want also their energy to become fossil fuel free. But it's a bit of a misconception. The vast majority of CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, of course, come from the rich countries like Angola or so. You can neglect. If you could give them coal power plants for their current electricity demand, it wouldn't be too terrible. So back to the electricity demand will double, right? So that would mean if we had 450 reactors by 2050, we would get 5% of the electricity out of those. If we wanted 50%, we would need 4,500 reactors, 10 times as many. So we have created in the past 60 years 450 reactors. So I do not see how the world will build 4,500 reactors in the next 30 years, right? They need to be financed, they need to be accepted by the population, which is a hard thing to do, right? So you basically end up with 3 new reactors every week worldwide over the next 30 years. So I don't see that this is going to happen, essentially, which is why I think that nuclear energy may have a future, but it will definitely not be the technology that saves us from climate disaster. Right? And then, of course, there's, well, let's look at the pros and cons. The big con I just told you, it's just coming too slow. We're not going to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by half, in half by 2030 using nuclear energy. It's simply not happening. The innovation cycles are like half a century long, right? That's endless. Like we want those things to run forever, essentially, like 5 decades or so. I'm saying lacking economy of scale. What I mean by that is like it's easy to add 100 megawatt to a solar plant or build a new one. It's a gradual growth, whereas nuclear plants are huge projects. Elections are won and lost over a nuclear power plant. The cost is enormous. The acceptance is low, despite them actually being relatively safe. I'd rather live near a nuclear power plant than near a coal plant, because coal also actually emits nuclear radioactivity because there's isotopes, right, that get into the air. And just the chronic pollution of air is very bad. I'd rather live with the risk of a nuclear disaster than near a coal plant where I know for sure that dirty particles are coming out. Right? The load factor is kind of high, much higher than solar and wind, but not far from like 90%, of course. And one big topic here is it's very complex to build these things. So it's only specialized companies that can build these nuclear reactors. I think there's the risk of proliferation, so terror organizations and other criminal organizations of all kinds might want to get hold of the nuclear or the fissionable material. The cost is high, right? We're talking about 4 to 8 billion per gigawatt, depending on which country. Whereas photovoltaics is now at 700 gigawatt peak at a cost of 2 billion per gigawatt. corrected already for the load factor, and wind is at 600 gigawatt peak already, and the cost is in a similar range. So solar and wind, as I said, can be quickly and easily expanded. It's cheap. Load factor is a problem, which is why we need to heavily invest in storage solutions. What's nice is that it kind of empowers local communities, right? So you can have like electricians, local electricians can put a solar system on a rooftop, right? That's a very nice thing. It will generate a lot of wealth to a lot of companies and their employees, whereas nuclear generates a lot of wealth to only a few companies. I think that's a big difference. You of course can't make weapons from solar panels or wind towers. But as I said, the energy storage is the demanding part in this whole thing. Right, so this is why I think nuclear has no future. So some may say, so what about small modular reactors? And my answer is simply, well, what about them? They don't even exist, right? You read a lot about modular reactors. Rolls-Royce just announced that they're investing in them. And I think they may play a role in the far future. But the problem is we only have a very short window where we can save the planet. So investing in something that will have a prototype in 10 or 15 years is simply too slow. I think I don't think investment in that field should be stopped. I think on the long run, it may actually work. But I also think that by the time we have functioning small modular reactors, we will have good enough storage and solar everywhere and wind everywhere that people will say, well, we kind of don't need them anymore. Bill Gates has also invested in small modular reactors, but for Bill Gates standards, only small amounts, like in the, I don't know, 50 to $100 million range. And he does that, right? If he really means it, he would invest $1 billion or so. He has enough of billions, right? So that's, and he then goes to governments and asks them for money, and then, you know, tax money is diverted into this small modular reactor idea, which I don't think will come early enough to save us from climate disaster, essentially, right? Bill Gates has been talking about this for 15 years, but they haven't gotten anywhere, unfortunately, I should say, right? But, well, so this brings us to the final conclusion, essentially, which are so what are the ingredients for change? Well, there's two ingredients, solar and wind. In particular, solar have become dirt cheap. The acceptance is high, right? And of course, there is basically a movement towards going away from fossil fuels, right? And that's definitely has been gaining traction over the past few years, Fridays for Future and so on. So the population, the people want this, right? The politicians are starting to understand. So there's, during the political process, this is all moving into the right direction. It has to move faster for sure, and I think the way to move fast is solar and wind and proper storage solutions. And that's essentially the end of my talk. I just want to give you some sources of where I get a lot of information from. Václav Smil writes a lot about energy. Excellent books. Bill Gates is a fan. He wrote a book about how to avoid climate disaster, which is a good summary of this. When I bought the book, I thought he might just promote his small modular reactor idea, but he actually doesn't. So it's a nice summary of the bigger books that Václav Smil writes. He sits in Winnipeg. He's a professor emeritus and thinks a lot about energy, essentially. Naomi Klein wrote also a very nice book a few years ago. If you speak Austrian, or German, I should say, which all of you do, I believe, here, the climate change book by, it's only like 150 pages or so, by Markus Watzak is quite a nice read. What's also interesting is this book by the economist Stefan Schulmeister. In the last one or two chapters, he describes how moving to a green way of producing our electricity and also insulating buildings and all these things, right? The Green Deal, how many jobs it will create and how good it will be for the economy, right? The transition is actually good for the economy. It's just not good for the present economy, right? The fossil fuel industry doesn't like it, so they say it's bad for the economy, but it's only bad for them. because they will be replaced by other companies, right? That will definitely benefit from it. And I believe in Schulmeister's book, the calculation he refers to some publications is that it will generate like economical growth, actually, economic growth of the economy by an additional 1%, right? So if you want to sustain growth, which is something that's like not really realistic, but by changing the system from fossil to green energy, that will provide another 10 years or so, or 15 years of growth, right? It's actually not necessarily given that we have to completely abandon the idea of economic growth. We just have to grow away from those huge fossil fuel companies, and they will basically disappear, and the growth will happen somewhere else, right? We will generate jobs and wealth for a lot of people, and it will take away wealth from just a few. So in that sense, it actually makes sense. And I believe this is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. It's very nice and very good, detailed information. So I'd like to open up the floor for questions or comments, or just maybe clarification questions, because you've had a lot of data and a lot of scenarios, of course, that you've offered to us. So my question to the audience: are there any questions you'd like to ask our speaker? You can do so by, yeah, Thomas, do you want to start?
Yeah, Alex, very much enjoyed the talk. Yeah, you know that I work for the Department of Energy, so some of the sources sounded familiar too. What are your thoughts on the role that hydrogen might play in a future energy environment? Do you think it has potential to be a major contributor?
Yes, I do actually think so. It's maybe not major, but it's a long-term storage of energy, right? So if we can generate hydrogen from solar and wind, right, then it can be transported in like trucks or pipelines to where it's needed. It has high energy density as well, right? So where you need high energy density, it will also play a role. You see the ideas that I think are not very smart to generate hydrogen with a nuclear power plant, right? A nuclear power plant already kind of generates a base load way of electricity. So I don't see the point of turning that into hydrogen. It should be done with a source of electricity or energy that is intermittent, that's solar and wind, right? And then you store it and then you can use it. So I think it does play a role. I don't think it plays I don't think it's going to play a big role. I think because the other storage solutions will catch up, and also hydrogen. Yeah, it also plays a role, of course, in fuel cells and such things. So, but it's hard to say. I haven't read a lot into hydrogen. I don't think it's going to be huge, but it will play a role. Yeah.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much. So it's interesting, like the scenarios that you've offered, like when I look at the two charts that you've had about, by 2030, we got to reduce CO2 emissions by 30%, you said, right? And then 50, by 2050, net zero. And then you have your calculations about the costs and the time spent on building nuclear energy. I think it's this very, very good, very powerful case that you make here. That maybe, the current trend that's moving towards nuclear infrastructure again is maybe not the best way to go about it, right? And so, I think it's very, very convincing cases that you deliver here. Are there any other questions to Alex about some aspects about the load factors, cost? Yeah, Traudl, do you wanna ask the next question? Oh no, Anne-Marie, please, Anne-Marie.
Yeah, hi. Two questions. One about hydrogen. It seems to me that France is actually deciding to use hydrogen for vehicles instead of electrical. Whereas in the US, it seems like the bet is on electrical vehicles. Mm-hmm. And my other question is about the storage in dams, like in Kaprun. Is that actually being done already? And where? Is that done in the US? Do you know?
Ooh, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I know it's done in wherever you have mountains, right? You have a lot of potential energy when you pump the water up. So that has been done routinely in Capron, just to save basically the energy that comes from I believe it's from what we get from the rivers, right? Which is like constant. And then you take that electricity to pump water into Capron, and then you can release it when there's peak times. There's also a case talking about peak. There's a bit of a case for like gas power plants, like natural gas, because they can kick in quickly. So I wouldn't. We have some of them already, right? So there is until we really have some larger scale, quickly available stored energy. Firing up a gas power plant for a few hours a day is not too terrible. Like if you have no other solution, it should be avoided. But and in hydrogen, I mean, hydrogen makes a lot of sense for like larger, like for trucks and so on, who need a lot of power and energy over a long time, right? They go 12 hours a day or so, or 10 hours a day or whatever. Their hydrogen makes sense. And batteries for cars, I mean, that problem is essentially already solved, right? They have enough range. I mean like 300 kilometers is enough, and especially if there's enough way there's enough opportunity to charge them.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the other thing for when it comes to batteries, like all the research goes into making them, like coming up with batteries that have a high capacity at low weight, right? So basically the car industry and maybe also cell phones and stuff, right? There should go some research into making batteries that are, stationary. They don't have to be that small. They don't have to have so many kilowatt hours per kilogram of battery, but that are cheaper, right? They can be big if they're in a house's basement or so, or somewhere in the garden. Mm-hmm. They don't have to be have such high energy density that they can be packed into a car. So I think there needs to be some. I think it's happening. There needs to be some research into that way of storing energy in batteries as well. Less expensive, bulkier, but doable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. What was surprising to me too is when you showed us the deaths that are generated or that are caused by these energy sources, that coal is much more deathly than the nuclear power stations, right? Because they're overall quite safe. I mean, if something happens, it's terrible, but it's terrible in a more confined way, right? And coal plants are everywhere, is that right? And now when you think about how governments have been delaying the shutdown of coal, and some governments haven't even considered yet closing that route of energy generation, that's real cause for concern, don't you think?
Yeah, I think if you have as a country, if you have nuclear power plants that are not too old and are safe, keep them running, right? Don't shut them down, and keep shut down the coal, of course, right? So yeah, so it was unfortunate, of course, that catastrophes such as Chernobyl happened, right? Because that really slowed down the energy production with nuclear energy. It would have been safe, relatively safe. It would have been clean, but it simply didn't happen, right? And I mean, of course, you can't exclude such catastrophes. I think it had to happen, right? It's unfortunate, but if you have 1,000 reactors, this happened when there was like 400 or so reactors in the world, right? And it happened, right? And now we're looking at maybe we need 4,000 reactors. It's hard to imagine that such a catastrophe does not happen again, even though the newer generations are much more reliable and safer. Mm-hmm. And you also have to make sure that nobody tries to access that nuclear material, right? You have to, they have to be secure, that people have to keep bad people away from them, right? It's not risk-free. Yeah. And also nuclear energy goes hand in hand with the military use of nuclear power, of course. So they're inseparable. That's one of the big problems, right? So the investment in nuclear energy, of course, was a military decision in the 50s, 40s, 50s, and was not an energy. It was also an energy decision, but it was mostly driven by military considerations.
It sounds like the liabilities of a kind that we haven't really considered, and then a costly one at best. Like if the costs are 4 times as high as with solar and wind.
Yeah.
And the time to construct them is are like very long time frames. So it's really, it's difficult. I mean, it's an obvious choice given the data that you've presented to us.
Yeah.
Andreas, there's another question, please. Oh, you need to unmute yourself, Andreas. Yeah.
I just did. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, all good.
Good afternoon from Toronto. Thank you, Alexander. It was a fascinating talk. I actually want to continue the thought of Stefan. But my question is, given the obvious economic and also ecological downsides of nuclear energy, and the strengths of renewable energies, why do you believe that countries like the UK have reshifted their energy policy towards nuclear? That kind of puzzles me, because I mean, you gave us a very powerful analysis that all the pros are actually on the end of the renewables.
Yeah, I guess Hinkley Point started in 2010, right? So they didn't want to go back, right? And I guess they're half finished now or so, somewhere in that range, right? They're not gonna stop that, and I guess it has a lot to do with power in the political sense as well. It has an influential companies and industries, and I can see that, right? If you have a nuclear industry, or if Rolls-Royce is going into that, right? It generates, of course, technology and jobs, and so that's probably why they promote it, or why they have a strong they used to have a strong lobby, right? I don't think they have any more. Than the numbers are clearly speaking against them now, but and China, for example, is also, as you saw, 17 reactors is not nothing, right? It's not huge, but they're doing it as well, right? And China they don't listen to lobbies or so. They just say, let's build it, right? They also don't listen to the population, whether they want that reactor or not, or power plant. They just build, right?
Well, with China, there's always the chance that it's a prestige factor, and that you want to show that you can do all sorts of things, including space race and nuclear power. And it could be part of a mix of energy, because they're doing solar as well, as it's shown in wind. But there's another question by Ali. Ali, please.
Hi, thank you very much. This was an incredibly interesting discussion, and I just going along with the same theme that we're going on. How do you convince populations that nuclear energy is a reliable and sustainable form of energy? As you said before, whole elections are lost because of a single reactor. Germany, in their Energiewende, has been trying to not only roll back nuclear in their own country, but also in neighboring countries. France has 80% of their electricity generated from nuclear. And how can two countries so close to one another have vastly different ideas on nuclear energy? How can you convince a population that we're not going to have another Chernobyl, that the technology is newer, that we're building miniature modular nuclear reactors that are safer, and that some of the reactors can be powered on spent nuclear fuel? How can we communicate that in an effective manner?
Yeah, I think I don't know. And I think even if we could, even if everyone says we want this, right, it would come too late. Because the small modular reactors we don't have yet. And if the capacity to build the regular reactors, we have to a certain degree, but we don't have the capacity to build 4,500 in 30 years. So I think I simply don't think it can actually happen. So even if everyone in the world will say, okay, let's do this, it would still come too late. That's actually my main concern. So yeah, and I don't think you can. I don't think you can convince the population that it's a good. In some areas you can, right? Somehow in France it happened, and they're happy with it, right? They didn't have any disasters. So of course, if you ask them, they're convinced. But I think that the time scales and the numbers are just not in our favor. It will happen too slow.
So does that mean that you that the only way forward will be solar, wind, and hydrogen?
Essentially, that's what I think. Yeah, that even though technically nuclear would be not a bad solution, it's just not happening fast enough. And it's stagnant, it's declining, whereas the others are growing very rapidly. And our investment should be into storage rather than nuclear.
Mm-hmm. Or then there's Dietrich, who's next, I think.
So basically to spin that thought further and probably to answer your question, does nuclear energy have a future? So somehow what I'm hearing, Alexander, is that the answer to that would be yes, but not as a sole reliable source for energy going forward. What I'm hearing is that there is a limited future based on basically existing power plants. We're not advocating for shutting them down. There might be a future, as long as they're built, in a safe fashion, and there might be a future for small modular reactors, but that's well in the future, and I think that may contribute. But it is basically one segment of the entire spectrum of needs for power sources, but it will not be the sole source for power, and therefore investment in other sources of power are dearly needed to get away from coal, basically.
Yeah, I agree. It will be a small. It will continue to play a smaller or a decreasing role, right? Because the other sectors are growing much faster. So yes, it will have a small future, so to say, right? But it will not be the technology that saves us from climate disaster, essentially.
So that'll be taking too long and too expensive, and maybe there's a risk that you can't really mitigate. Sonia, you're next, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. That was a really very interesting talk. So I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about Germany and their decision to not only no longer build nuclear, but to actively shut down what are probably some of the safest nuclear power plants in the world. You've kind of answered that or danced around that answer already, but I just wanted you to maybe speak a little more on that.
Yeah, it's interesting that they actually shut them down, right? I think it's a bad idea. If you have them, you should keep them, given the situation. Especially because when Fukushima happened 10 years ago, right, that was before solar got really cheap. And then it was basically, the German government nevertheless decided to shut nuclear down. It's interesting. It's hard to understand because the decision basically was also supported by Merkel, who is a physicist. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure what happened there and why they made that decision.
Could it have to do with sort of, like the traumatic experience of, Fukushima, Chernobyl, all those things that are sort of, talk to the victims of those catastrophes, then of course, I mean, it's a clear case, and then there's sort of a kind of people get emphatic about, and I think, I mean, so basically what you're saying is that if you have a power plant that is built and that's commissioned until 2060, then keep them running, but build new power sources that are more sustainable, right? That are not nuclear, right? Yeah. But I think the decision to shut them down now and to replace them with greener sources, non-nuclear green sources, right? Is one thing that has to do something with social justice, with equity, right? Because there will be people living next to those nuclear power stations who will be the first ones to suffer the consequences.
Yeah, the big topic of climate justice, right? It's you can achieve that much better with things that can be installed by anyone essentially. Like every electrician can put a solar system on someone's rooftop. That I think is a big bonus also for wind, and like small communities can decide to have a wind power plant. A small community cannot decide to get a nuclear reactor. I mean, maybe in the far future they can say, hey, let's get one of those SMRs for like 20 to 50 million euro or so. But right now that's not an option, unfortunately. Or maybe fortunately, because I do think that that wind and solar. I mean, of course, we also have hydroelectricity, right? But that's been around for, I don't know, centuries is almost. I mean, British Columbia, where we are, Stefan, you and I, right? It's essentially all hydro. So when I moved here, I saw that they were heating with electric, like this electric heaters. I thought that's a crazy idea, right? In a way it is, because heat pumps would be much better. But on the other hand, it's in this moderate climate in Vancouver, using electricity is actually a good idea if it's produced in a green way.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I think it's now we're 4 minutes past 11. Unless there's another question, I think I'd like to thank our speaker for a very informative talk, and talk that gets us going and thinking about all things. About, of course, there's always the emotional element when it comes to nuclear, and the Austrian perspective is clear, right? And I guess the Germans just adopted this Austrian point of view, which is totally understandable, of course. But no, let's thank our speaker, and the talk will be edited and then posted on YouTube for many more views. And thank you for joining us this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are. So let's thank our speaker for a really very informative talk, and job well done. Thank you very much, Alex.
Yeah, thanks. Small audience, but very high quality audience. I think everyone asked
very good question,
right? Better than 100 people who don't ask any questions. Excellent. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone.